Hello, I am Sam Smith, and this is Sam's Mcat Basics. This podcast covers the most important topics put out on the AAMC Mcat each year, and I determined this list by going through all the official practice materials that the AAMC puts out, and also some third-party practice material, and just put together this big list of topics that consistently kept on showing up, and ranked those topics and made podcasts out of it. This podcast is going to cover the endocrine system, which is one of the higher yield organ systems on the MCAT. I typically have seen the nervous system a little bit more. So if you haven't listened to the nervous system podcast, go do that. But the endocrine system still shows up a lot, so it's still important. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to cover the hormones. I'll go over the types of hormones, their origin, and their action mechanism. And then I'll talk about the structures involved within the endocrine system. And what's important to know here is essentially which hormones originate from which structure. And then lastly, I'll talk about some common diseases that afflict the endocrine system. And this should be the most interesting part just because I'll talk into detail about some of the mechanisms, give you guys an interesting background into some of these diseases. And this material will show up on 2 out of the 4 MCAT sections, the biochemistry biology section and also the chemistry physics section. It's important to note, though, that really the main part of this will be the biology and biochem sections. You may see something about it on chemistry physics, but it's mostly going to just be referenced. It's going to be referenced to, and then you'll probably perform some kind of calculation regarding that. So, most important to know for the biochem section. So, let's get started. So before I get into talking about hormones, I briefly want to discuss cell-to-cell communication. So I think it's easy to think of cells as living all alone in isolation, away from everything, just kind of as these isolated little bodies. However, cells are constantly communicating with surrounding cells and even very distant cells. And one way they communicate with very distant cells is through hormones. But before I introduce hormones, I'm going to talk about the 4 main ways that the cells communicate with each other. So there's 4 different ways. The first is Autocrine Signaling. The second is Juxtacrine Signaling, then Paracrine Signaling, and then the last one is Endocrine Signaling. Autocrine Signaling is a form of cell signaling in which a cell secretes a hormone or some kind of chemical messenger called the autocrine agent that binds to autocrine receptors on the same cell that release this messenger, leading to changes in that cell. So, quick example, in 2016 there was a paper on tumor-derived exosomes that showed that these exosomes are released by tumor cells and that they can act as autocrine signalers. So essentially, these exosomes are information carriers, right? So they convey molecular and genetic messages. So they'll contain either DNA or something that maybe transcription factor, something that changes the cell or gives a message to the cell. And so what happens in the case of these tumor cells is these tumor cells will release these exosomes and then they'll come back to the actual cell itself and act as an autocrine agent, right? Then the cell will uptake this exosome and sends these molecular messages to itself. And so what happens is this acts as a positive feedback loop, right? As the cell becomes more phenotypically like a tumor cell, it's going to release more of these exosomes. And that, in a sense, is going to continue moving it down the path towards a tumor cell. It's going to keep that cell growing bigger and bigger. I don't know necessarily what the phenotype of a tumor cell is, but these exosomes act as a positive feedback through autocrine signaling. So the next type of signaling is called juxtacrine signaling, and this is extracellular matrix signaling in multicellular organisms that requires direct contact. And the key words here is direct contact. So this is when exoskeletons of different cells hook up, essentially they link together, and messages are passed between the cells. And this happens in a few different ways. I don't think it's that important to know how these different mechanisms work. Just remember that juxtacrine signaling it requires direct contact between cells. And this is very important for neuronal development. It plays a huge role in neuronal development. The next type of cell communication I'm going to talk about is paracrine signaling. So paracrine signaling is when cells produce a signal to induce changes in nearby or adjacent cells. And so this is also considered local action. So this applies to cells that are within the same region as other cells, right? So this is cells that aren't in your foot compared to in your brain or something, right? These are cells that are located together. And so what happens is cells will secrete some kind of signaling molecule that is then uptaken by nearby cells. A good example of this is synaptic signaling, right? You have two neurons. At the end of the neuron, you have neurotransmitters that are released into the synaptic cleft, and then these diffuse across the synapse and bind to receptors on the dendrites of the postsynaptic cell. So that is a good example of paracrine signaling. The last kind of cell-to-cell communication I want to talk about is called endocrine signaling. And this is when specialized cells produce signaling molecules that are released into the bloodstream, which carries them to target cells in distant parts of the body. And so this is distinct from paracrine signaling in that it acts over long distances, right? These specialized signaling molecules that are released into the blood, they travel a long distance. This is potentially communication from the brain all the way down to the foot. And that's not necessarily scientific. I don't know if that actually happens, but in theory it could. Think about it this way. Endocrine signaling is like a long distance relationship. You got to send letters and love letters and all that shit. However, paracrine signaling is like a girlfriend that lives with you. You know, you can act locally, if you know what I'm saying. And so you can think about it that way, if it helps. And so to put this into perspective for you, hormones are the signaling molecules that are released in endocrine signaling. They travel through the bloodstream and they act on distant targets. And hormones will be the next topic I discuss. So again, what's important to understand about hormones are number one, where they're produced, number two, their structure or type, and that relates to their mechanism of action. So what I'm going to do first, I'm going to go over the different types of hormones. I'll talk about their structure, and I'll talk about how they function, and then I'll introduce the structures of the endocrine system, and then I'll talk about which hormones are produced in each of those structures. All right, so there are four main types of hormones. There are peptide or protein hormones, there are amino acid-derived hormones, there's steroid hormones, and then there's lipid-derived hormones. And specifically, I'm going to talk about ecosinoids. So number one, protein and peptide hormones. So protein or peptide hormones are hormones that are made up of amino acids. Typically, they are polypeptides. And so it's important to note here that peptide hormones are typically shorter than protein hormones. So you can think of peptide hormones as, like 10 amino acids long, whereas protein hormones are, maybe thousands. They're actual proteins. Peptides are just these small little stretches of amino acids. And both of these are synthesized just like any other protein in the body, right? You have DNA that's transcribed to mRNA and then translated into a protein or a peptide in this case. And it's important to note that these are synthesized as prohormones, and then they need further activation or further processing to become active. And so what's their function? So proteins, as I'm sure you know by now, or hopefully you know, are water soluble. So therefore they are soluble within the blood. So they can travel through the blood easily, right? They dissolve in the blood. But since they're large and they're usually charged, they can't diffuse through the plasma membrane. So what they do is they dissolve in the blood, and then they act on cells by binding to the exterior of cells, since they can't get all the way into cells. And what this does is this causes a signal transduction pathway to get started. And because this signal transduction pathway is amplified at each step, this is a very fast-acting response. It's fast and it's a hard response. And so you might be wondering, okay, it makes sense that these signal transduction pathways lead to greater amplification, but you might be kind of wondering why. So I'm going to give you a quick example and kind of show you how this works. So say we have some inactivated or inactive adenyl cyclase, right? You have your molecule, your hormone that binds to the receptor on a cell surface, and now you activate that adenyl cyclase. Well, now you're activating 100 adenyl cyclase molecules when that hormone binds to the receptor. Now, one adenyl cyclase molecule is going to go and turn 100 ATP into cyclic AMP, right? So that one molecule turned 100 ATP into cyclic AMP. Now, one of those cyclic AMP is going to go activate one protein kinase A. So that step doesn't have any amplification. But then that active protein kinase A is going to phosphorylate 10 different molecules or 10 different proteins, right? So you can see at each step, one molecule of X is going to activate, 10 to 100 molecules of Y. So at each step, you have this subsequent amplification, and that's why you have this very fast, strong response to peptide or protein hormones. So just a quick example of an actual peptide hormone, in this case, peptide protein hormone, and in this case, it's a protein, is insulin, right? And so you can think of this as the following. So when you have a rise or a drop in blood sugar, you want to be able to respond to that very quickly. So you need this fast response that insulin provides. All right, again, 2 takeaways from protein peptide hormones. They dissolve in the blood, and they bind to the exterior of cells at some receptor, and they lead to a very fast, quick response. So the second class of hormones are called steroid hormones. And the structure is something definitely to know. It's this 4-ringed structure, very hydrophobic, lots of nonpolar carbon-to-carbon bonds, carbon-to-hydrogen bonds, and it is synthesized from cholesterol. And because these are really nonpolar, or it has a lot of nonpolar bonds, it's not soluble in the blood. So an important note here is that the steroid hormones require some kind of carrier protein in order to be transported in the blood. And you can kind of think of these as people, right? If we want to go a long distance, what do we need? Most people nowadays aren't going to walk all the way, right? You need something to carry you. So think about yourself as a steroid hormone, right? You need some kind of transportation. You need a protein like a bus to go take you this long distance. So what about their function? So since these are nonpolar, they can actually diffuse across the plasma membrane. So what they do is they diffuse across the plasma membrane, where then they bind to receptors in the nucleus of the cell and go on to affect transcription. And so in this case, there's no signal transduction, right? You just have this one molecule diffusing in and binding to one receptor that leads to one change in transcription. So these tend to act a lot more slowly than peptide or protein hormones. An example here is a corticosteroid. And, this is kind of gross, but you can think about it a little this way. If you've ever used a corticosteroid cream for a rash, you know that it takes a little bit to work, right? You put it on, it doesn't immediately provide relief. It takes, maybe half an hour. And I'm guessing that because this is a steroid and its mechanism of action is to actually affect transcription of a cell, that this has something to do with that. And, if you actually know and that this is bullshit and that's not the case, like shoot me an email or something like that, but I'm pretty sure that this is the reason why that is. So takeaways from steroid hormones. Number 1, not soluble in the blood, therefore they need to transport protein. Number 2, they are able to diffuse across the plasma membrane and they go on to affect transcription. And because of that, they're kind of slower acting. All right, the third class of hormones are called amino acid derived. And so the structure is kind of exactly what it sounds like. These are derived from single amino acids. And these are typically either derived from tryptophan, and this is something like melatonin, so melatonin is derived from tryptophan, or they're derived from tyrosine, and that's something like adrenaline, which is also called epinephrine. And in terms of their solubility within the blood, they're kind of a hybrid of both the steroid hormones and then the peptide protein hormones. So some of them can actually dissolve in the blood, and then some of them actually need to be carried by some kind of carrier protein. And same with their function. Some of these are able to move across the membrane and affect transcription. Some of them bind to extracellular receptors on cells. Just depends. So because of this, they can either act fast, like adrenaline, or they can act slow, like the thyroid hormones. So imagine if, you can kind of think about adrenaline. What if adrenaline, which is also called epinephrine, was a slow-acting hormone? We'd be screwed, right? You'd see something that freaked you out, but then, you wouldn't feel those effects of the heart beating faster and your veins dilating and everything that happens when adrenaline is released into the body. You wouldn't feel that till like an hour later, and that wouldn't help you. So then to summarize, amino acid-derived hormones can essentially either act like the steroid hormones or they can act like the peptide hormones. They're a mixture of both. And lastly, let's talk about ecosinoids, which are, again, lipid-derived hormones. In terms of their structure, they are made of arachidonic acid, which is a type of fatty acid that is made out of 20 carbons. So anytime you see a 20-carbon fatty acid, think of ecosinoids or think of some kind of signaling molecule. And so they have a very mixed mechanism of action. You don't need to know that, really. Just realize that these are 20 carbons long and be able to recognize that. And they act in a variety of different processes. So, for example, they act in osteoclast differentiation, vascular function and regulation. They modulate blood clotting, very diverse and different types of regulation. And there are three main ecosinoids to know. There's prostaglandin, thromboxans, and leukotrienes. And if you want to know more about these, go listen to the Biomolecules podcast. All right, now that I've talked a little bit about the structure and mechanism of action of these different hormones, let's get into the structures involved within the endocrine systems and where these different hormones actually originate from. So there are quite a few major organs to know in the endocrine system. So the first is the hypothalamus, then the pituitary, the adrenal glands, the pancreas, the testes and the ovaries, the pineal gland, the parathyroid and the thyroid, and then also the thymus. So I'm going to go over these glands, give you a bit of information about each and what hormones are produced in each. So first is the hypothalamus. And this is commonly known as the bridge between the nervous system and the endocrine system. It sits in the brain, and it releases a lot of hormones that spur on the release of other hormones. So these are called tropic hormones. And again, these are hormones that signal the release of other hormones. And there's a few other hormones of note. You have antidiuretic hormone, which is made in the hypothalamus. And antidiuretic hormone or vasopressin acts on the kidneys to increase water reabsorption. You also have oxytocin made in the hypothalamus. And oxytocin stimulates uterine contraction during childbirth. And lastly, you have dopamine made, which is a neurotransmitter and also acts as a hormone. And it's important to note that a lot of these other tropic hormones are all called blank releasing hormone. And so you'll know, number one, that that's a tropic hormone. And number two, you'll know that, if it's X releasing hormone, then you'll know that it spurs on the release of hormone X. The next gland to note is the pituitary. And so the pituitary is made up of the anterior and posterior pituitary. You're going to want to know what hormones are produced in each of those. So in the anterior pituitary, there is a good mnemonic to remember what hormones are produced, and it's flat peg. Easy to remember, right? That's what your ex-boyfriend has. And so, again, flat peg stands for FSH, which is follicle stimulating hormone, LH, which is luteinizing hormone, adrenocorticotropic hormone, thyroid stimulating hormone, prolactin, endorphins, and growth hormone. And then on the other hand, you have the posterior pituitary, and you have two hormones that are released by the posterior pituitary, and that is antidiuretic hormone, and oxytocin. Again, so those are made in the hypothalamus. They are stored and released in the posterior pituitary. The next gland to know is called the pineal gland. And there's one hormone to really know from the pineal gland, and that's melatonin, which makes you sleepy. And you'll know that if you've ever taken a supplement that is melatonin, you'll know what I'm talking about. That makes you just pass right out. The next glands I want to talk about are the testes and the ovaries. I'm sure you know what these make. These make testosterone. Both of them make testosterone. The ovaries make a very small amount of testosterone, but there are measurable amounts of testosterone that the ovaries make. Testes, of course, make a lot more. The ovaries, in addition to testosterone, make estrogen, and these hormones give us our male and female characteristics. Next is the parathyroid and the thyroid. And among other things, they work in opposition to each other in terms of blood calcium levels. The parathyroid produces parathyroid hormone, which increases calcium levels in the blood by stimulating breakdown of bone. And the thyroid, on the other hand, produces calcitonin, which you can think about. Calcitonin tones down the amount of calcium in your blood by blocking osteoclast activity. And so osteoclasts are what break down bone. So again, parathyroid, thyroid, they work against each other in terms of raising blood calcium and lowering blood calcium. It's also important to note that the thyroid produces two other pretty important hormones, and they are T3 and T4. So T3 is known as triiodothyronine, and T4 is known as thyroxine, and they're both responsible for the regulation of metabolism. And I'll talk a little bit more about these when I talk about hyperthyroidism and hypothyroidism. The next gland to know is the adrenal gland. And so this sits right on top of the kidneys, and it produces epinephrine and norepinephrine, which are also called adrenaline and noradrenaline. And this is what spurs on our fight or flight response. In addition to epinephrine and norepinephrine, the adrenal glands produce mineral corticoids, which an example of a mineral corticoid is aldosterone, which increases sodium and water retention, which raises blood pressure. Again, that works through the kidneys. The glucocorticoids are also produced in the adrenal gland. And an example of a glucocorticoid is cortisol, which is a stress hormone that increases blood sugar and has a bunch of different effects. But one of those is to increase blood sugar. The next endocrine organ to know is called the pancreas. And the pancreas produces both glucagon and insulin. And glucagon and insulin work against each other. Glucagon increases blood sugar by breaking down glycogen and stimulating gluconeogenesis, among other things. And insulin lowers blood sugar by stimulating glucose uptake in cells. And also, both of those do a bunch of different things, but I'm kind of hitting the main points. So when you hear pancreas, think about blood glucose regulation. And the last organ I want to talk about is called the thymus. And so the thymus creates T lymphocytes, and these travel around the body and fight infections. And as you could assume, with T cells, they are immune cells, so they're part of the immune system. You might be thinking to yourself, okay, these are T lymphocytes. How is it? Is this a hormone? What hormones does this create? Well, the thymus actually creates hormones that regulate the maturation of T cells. All right, so now that I've covered the different structures of the endocrine system, let's get into a few different endocrine diseases and talk about how they work. All right, so there's a few endocrine system-related diseases that I want to talk about. The first is hyperthyroidism and hypothyroidism. The second is hyper and hypogonadism. And then the third is diabetes. So hyperthyroidism is an overactive thyroid gland. And then on the other hand, hypothyroidism is an underactive thyroid gland. So people who have a overactive thyroid gland tend to produce a lot more T3 and T4 hormones. And if you remember, what these hormones do is they influence metabolism. They increase metabolism. So if you're producing a lot of those, in the case of hyperthyroidism, you tend to have an overactive metabolism, and these patients tend to be very skinny. On the other hand, if you're not producing enough of these hormones, then you have a slower than usual metabolism and therefore have hypothyroidism. These patients, on the other hand, tend to be overweight. There may be some of you that are thinking about hyperthyroidism and thinking, man, that sounds great. I can eat whatever I want. My metabolism is so high, I just eat, and I don't gain any weight. And it's not quite as fun as it sounds, though. There's a lot of other symptoms that go along with hyperthyroidism, stuff like nervousness, anxiety, heart palpitations, rapid pulse, fatigability, tremors, muscle weakness, a lot of different things. So it's not just that, these people can't put on any weight and, they live a pretty normal life. They have a lot of other symptoms. So just a little something to consider next time you think about self-induction of hyperthyroidism. And just a kind of an aside, there are a ton of weight loss pills that you can take that are associated with T3, the T3 hormone in some sense. So they either claim to be a T3 analog or they say that they stimulate T3 production. These are probably BS, though. Obviously, these kind of supplements aren't regulated by the FDA. They can literally say whatever they want. However, there are some people in bodybuilding that have been known to use T3 and T4 hormones, the actual hormones, and inject themselves with them. And it works in terms of losing fat, but it is dangerous and not necessarily a good idea to do. And again, going back to T4 and T3, it's important to remember that these are both steroid hormones that bind to nuclear receptors. So they affect transcription and act relatively slowly in terms of their course of action. And let's quickly go over the causes of hypothyroidism and then hyperthyroidism. So hypothyroidism is most commonly caused by an immune disorder. So this typically occurs when you have autoimmune inflammation of the thyroid gland. And then the second most common cause is post-therapeutic hypothyroidism, and this can occur during treatment for hyperthyroidism, where you overtreat the hyperthyroidism and become hypothyroidic. So what about the causes of hyperthyroidism? And again, this is the excess secretion of thyroid hormones, which then increases the rate of metabolism in your body. And the number one cause of hyperthyroidism is Graves' disease, and this is another autoimmune disorder, and it's characterized by the production of antibodies that activate the thyroid stimulating hormone receptor, resulting in the stimulation of T4 and T3 production, which then also leads to the enlargement of the thyroid. And other causes of hyperthyroidism are a multinodular goiter. Iodine can induce this, and very rarely a thyroid-stimulating hormone secreting pituitary tumor can cause hyperthyroidism. So that's a brief kind of synopsis of hyper and hypothyroidism. And what you really need to take away here is that hypothyroidism is a decrease in these T4, T3 hormones, which then results in a slowed down metabolism and results in an overweight patient, whereas hyperthyroidism is an oversecretion of these T3, T4 hormones, which then results in an increased metabolism and very skinny patients. The second endocrine disease I want to talk about is hyper and hypogonadism. And so this is a dysregulation in the production of either testosterone or estrogen. Hypogonadism is a condition in which the body does not produce enough of the hormone called testosterone. And obviously this hormone plays a key role in masculine growth and development during puberty. And then hypergonadism, on the other hand, is a condition in which there is a hyperfunction of the gonads. And so this leads to an increase in the levels of testosterone and estrogen above their normal levels. So this leads to an abnormally high level of both of these hormones. And these hormones are both critical sex hormones, or hormones critical for sex development. I am briefly going to touch on a few interesting things related to hypogonadism, again, which is when the body does not produce enough testosterone. So there are two basic types of hypogonadism. The first is primary, and this is when the problem originates in the actual testicles themselves. There is also secondary hypogonadism. And so this is a type of hypogonadism that indicates a problem in the hypothalamus or the pituitary gland. And again, this is part of the brain that signals the testicles to produce testosterone. So if you think about it, a secondary form of this disease is essentially an upstream problem, where a primary form of this disease is a problem with the machinery itself, the gonads, the testes, the cojones. So just to tie back to the hypothalamus, let's think about how this would work with secondary hypogonadism. So the hypothalamus produces the gonadotropin-releasing hormone, which then signals to the pituitary gland to make follicle-stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. And then luteinizing hormone is released by the pituitary, goes down through your bloodstream to your testes, where then it signals the testes to produce testosterone. So, some kind of tumor maybe in the pituitary or something going on with your brain in the hypothalamus could mess up this signaling at any step, really, and that would produce secondary hypergonadism. An example of primary hypogonadism would be something like, say you are walking along a fence, you're a little kid, you're walking on a fence because you think it's fun, and you are walking, and all of a sudden, a bird comes out of nowhere, and it whizzes right by your head, and it kind of freaks you out. You lose your balance, and you fall, and so you land directly on top of your testicles. And this story comes from no personal experience, but let's say you have to lose one of your testicles. Well, now that testicle is not producing testosterone, so that's a problem that originates in the testicle. And that could lead to some form of hypogonadism if you lose some of the testosterone that you were producing. It's also important to mention that primary hypogonadism can be caused by Klinefelter syndrome, which is 2 or more X chromosomes in the presence of 1 Y chromosome. So if you're a normal human male, you have 1 X, 1 Y, but somebody with Klinefelters would be XXY or XXXY. And so for the most part, they're pretty normal, except for there's some, I can't quite remember exactly from genetics what all the manifestations are, but one of those manifestations is that they can have primary hypogonadism. Before I move on to diabetes, it's important to understand that any disease really that's within the endocrine system that's either described as hypo this or hypo this, that those prefixes mean, first of all, hyper is secretion of too much of a hormone, and then hypo is under secretion. So just know that those hyper and hypo can both be applied to different sets of hormones to describe different conditions relating to the endocrine system. So I saved the best endocrine disease for last. That's diabetes. And by best, I don't mean that it's good for people or anything. What I mean is that the Mcat loves diabetes. You're probably going to see it at some point, and also it's very interesting. So there are 2 types of diabetes. There is type 1 and type 2. Type 1 is an autoimmune condition where essentially the body attacks the pancreas, and this results in damaged beta cells within the pancreas that are not able to make insulin. This is also called juvenile onset diabetes. Type 2 diabetes is a much more common disease, and it's considered adult onset diabetes. And this is caused by insulin resistance. And there's a lot of different risk factors that are involved. And I'll get into the pathophysiology a little bit. So let's start with the pathophysiology that underlies type 1 diabetes. So type 1 diabetes is typically diagnosed using 3 very common symptoms. The first is polydipsia. And so this is when somebody has is very, very thirsty. They have excessive thirst. And oddly enough, that sounds like it actually kind of describes one of my ex-girlfriends. Weird. Anyways. And then you have polyphagia, which is excessive hunger. And then polyuria, which is excessive urination. So you're really thirsty, you're really hungry, and you pee a lot. And these three symptoms are paired with hyperglycemia, which is high blood sugar. And so the underlying causes are, as I said before, an autoimmune disorder. And essentially what happens is you have these beta pancreas cells that secrete insulin, and they get destroyed by the body. And so according to a paper I read about this, there are a dozen different proposed mechanisms which are said to be kind of controversial within the field. So just understand that type 1 diabetes results in autoimmune destruction, meaning your own body cells destroys these insulin-producing beta pancreatic cells. So you might be wondering what exactly causes this type 1 diabetes. Is it a genetic disease? Is it environmental? Well, the answer in short is that it's a combination. So the disease is strongly influenced by a lot of genetic factors. It doesn't fit some simple Mendelian genetics pattern, though. However, it's a multifactorial in its inheritance, and we can look at twin studies and see that there is a measurable genetic effect. So you look at identical twins, and you can see that there's a disease concordance rate of between 30 and 50%. Then you can look at dizygotic twins that do not share the same genes or the exact same genes, and you can see that they have a concordance of between 6 to 10%. So if you share the same genes, you have a much higher likelihood of having this disease, meaning that part of it is due to genetics. The rest of that is due to some environmental factors, not really sure what else, but it's not purely genetic. It's a combination of both, like a lot of diseases. All right, let's talk about type 2 diabetes now. So again, this is adult onset diabetes, and there's a lot of different risk factors. This includes being obese, being over 45, having a family history of type 2 diabetes, and then also being a lot of different ethnicities. So being African American, Alaskan Native, American Indian, Asian American, and Hispanic, and Hawaiian or Pacific Islander have the propensity to increase your risk for diabetes or type 2 diabetes. And so how are these patients diagnosed? Well, there are several criteria that are used independently to establish diagnosis. And essentially what these criteria look for are increased blood glucose levels, right? They're looking for, okay, if I give you 75 grams of glucose, let's look at your tolerance to that glucose. Let's see what your blood sugar levels do. And then they'll look at your fasting plasma glucose levels over a 3-day fast and see how those decrease, see if they decrease normally. Now, what is the underlying cause of type 2 diabetes? Well, type 2 diabetes develops when beta cells in the pancreas fail to secrete sufficient insulin to keep up with the demand. And usually this is in context to some increased insulin resistance. And so what is insulin resistance? Well, insulin resistance is when cells in your muscles, fat, or liver don't respond well to insulin and can't easily take up glucose from your blood. And then as a result of this, your pancreas makes more insulin to help your glucose enter your cells. And eventually your pancreas can't make enough insulin to overcome your cell's weak response to that insulin. And at that point, your blood glucose levels go above the healthy range and you are considered a type 2 diabetic. So that is a brief interlude into diabetes. Type 1 diabetes is juvenile onset. Type 2 is adult onset, develops from poor health or poor diet, as well as other risk factors that I described above. What's really important to understand here, though, is the difference between the two. So if you don't understand it after I just went and talked about it, rewind 2 minutes or 3 minutes or however long I talked about it and listen to it again. It's very important to know for the MCAT. All right, that wraps up the Endocrine System podcast. If you like the podcast, go rate it on iTunes, leave us a review, whatever you're going to do. I appreciate you listening and hope you listen to the next one. All right, now time for the Mcat Advice of the Day segment. So I want to talk a little bit about cars today, and just in full disclosure, cars was definitely my least lowest scoring subject on the MCAT, and I really wish I would have put more time into it. I really wish that's something I would have done. However, what I want to say about it is that don't look at it as something that you can't study for, you can't get better at. It is something you can study for. Go through, read a lot of passages, spend a good chunk of time analyzing why you got questions wrong in the passages, and think about what the MCAT was looking for. The AAMC puts out, I think, 2 different question packs that have a bunch of different questions for, or actually it's passages. Are there passages in the question packs? There might not be, but whatever it is, they put out a bunch of passages that are pretty good in accordance with the actual passages you'll see. So practice with those. You know, there's also some online ones. I used Jack Weston, for instance. There's other ones that you can use. But my point here is really practice that and study for cars like you would study for the other sections. Don't be like me and be kind of pissed off because you didn't do as well as you would have liked to do on that section. Hey, what are you doing? Hey. Sam's MCAT Basics is written, produced, and recorded by Murph the Dog. Special thanks to Murph the Dog for this episode.